So, Renato, has the Supreme Court basically allowed Trump to destroy the Department of Education?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Renato Mariani. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rengappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a scheme. So, Asha, I feel like for our first topic today, it's an obvious topic for this week. The Supreme Court's order, really part of that shadow docket, that many are arguing, including the three Democratic appointees who dissented, that this is essentially allowing Trump to destroy the Department of Education.
Yeah, so I did ask Asha a few weeks ago that kind of helps people who maybe don't have legal backgrounds make sense of the shadow docket and why it's important, because these are all things that are coming up in terms of interim relief. Like, do we allow the injunction to stand, or is the Supreme Court going to stay the injunction? And the reason that's important is because that determines whether the administration can continue what it's doing or not continue what it's doing until the courts even decide whether it's legal. And what we're seeing is the Supreme Court is often, in these cases, allowing the government to continue doing what it's doing before the actual legal merits are decided, but without really explaining why it's allowing them to continue doing it. And the issue here is that Trump issued an executive order it's Executive Order 14242, called Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities, which effectively authorizes the Secretary of Education to, close the Department of Education. That's exactly what it says in the actual executive order. It says closing the Department of Education and returning authority to the states. I was stumbling on that phrase because I know you and I are going to get into whether or not that's actually what he's doing. But to that end, she's basically fired 50% of the Department of Education, and entities that were affected by that brought a lawsuit saying that this is illegal, because this is in violation of the law, because the Department of Education was created by statute and there are certain statutory functions it has to fulfill. There are certain requirements that the department has to follow before it completely downsizes or eliminates parts of it. And the lower courts had issued an injunction, which was upheld by the appellate court, but basically the Supreme Court stayed the injunction, which allows the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, to continue doing what she's doing. So that's just sort of the background. And I think it's important because it gets really confusing, I think, in terms of where we are in these cases. Some people believe that this is sort of the final say, and it's not the final say, but it has a real impact regardless.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, this is a really good topic for this podcast and our discussion, Asha, because, I had given a talk yesterday to the local Indivisible group, and people were really confused about a lot of the details of things. And I think that's what we try to do here is I think sometimes these distinctions matter. So I guess one way I would I wouldn't say take issue, but I have there's a little space between my perspective on it and maybe the dissents, is that there's no question that Trump's intent is to destroy the Department of Education. And he said it in that executive order. I think he said it in many other occasions. I think he's not the only Republican who said that. I think we know that that's what the Republicans intend to do. But of course, the question right now is focused on what Trump, what has happened already in the short run, and what is this order meant to restrain him, to restrain the Department of Education, the Secretary of Education, from doing. From my perspective, in part, what Trump's teams, I was going to say minions, but his team or whatever his people are doing is, I think, a clever way of trying to get things done, move the, death by a thousand cuts. So getting rid of half the workforce of the Department of Education doesn't mean the Department of Education doesn't exist. I think there may be different reasons why taking some functions away from the department, because that's another thing that this is about, is taking things like the student loan portfolio and moving it to the Small Business Administration and other things that they were doing. They might violate certain statutes, but does that mean taking certain functions away or firing some employees? Does that mean that the department doesn't exist altogether? I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should bookmark that question for a moment, though, because in terms of this order that the Supreme Court issued, again, this is about interim relief, whether the injunction that was issued by the lower court and upheld by the appellate court should stand. And, what the Trump administration, they weren't even making an argument that they were going to be likely to succeed on the legal merits. They were making a standing issue that the people bringing this lawsuit, didn't have standing. And I thought there was a very interesting article on Substack that's written by our colleague Steve Vladeck, which talked about how the court has treated the Trump administration very differently than the Biden administration. And he used the loan forgiveness program lawsuit as a counterpoint. And in that case, that also was challenged, and there were standing issues that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in that case, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's injunction, which were, by the way, coming from conservative courts, to wait and see these complicated standing issues. Let's let these the parties brief them and let that all percolate or whatever. He points out that Biden's loan forgiveness program was basically put on hold for 6.5 months until the court decided that it was ready to rule on the standing issues. Whereas with the Trump administration, they don't want to put a pause on anything.
Right.
They seem to believe that there is a harm to the executive branch when you prevent the executive branch from implementing its policies. Again, only seemingly when it's Trump who's sitting in the Oval Office, but that even if at somewhere down the line, presumably it turns out that it's illegal. And as you noted, they didn't give any reasons for this order. They, it's just like one paragraph saying we're staying the injunction. But as you noted, there was a dissent, a 19-page dissent that the three liberal justices laid out, where they basically excoriated the court for, for staying this injunction and kind of allowing these firings to proceed because of the harm that is going to end up ensuing as a result of it.
Yeah, I think. Look, one thing that's without a doubt, I think, is that the courts, particularly the United States Supreme Court right now, take executive authority and executive control and the ability to manage the executive function of government very seriously right now, right? There's like almost like this, they've got to protect that ability to do it. And I think you're right that there's that urgency didn't exist perhaps a year ago this time or something, if you want to be very pointed about it. But I think that, the standing issue, I think, is somewhat complicated. I mean, essentially, what the argument is, these are states, for example, that are making this argument as the plaintiffs here. And they're essentially saying, like, this reduction in workforce is going to have a downstream effect on the services that are being provided by the Department of Education, the provision of money and so other things by the Department of Education. That's complicated to prove. It's not entirely clear that is the case. It's not like the employees. I think it would be a different thing if like the employees union or the individual employees are bringing it. It would be a much easier, straightforward case. But I think the bottom line is once And I think what the dissent is pointing out is once the employees are fired, it's very difficult to undo that, right? Once there's a riff and you have, 1,000 plus people, what is it, 1,500 people, something like that, who are fired, it's hard to undo it.
Well, the standing issues are complicated, but I would like to point out that they were even more complicated in the loan forgiveness case. Because if you'll recall there, the states were bringing a suit on behalf of the loan servicing provider. In other words, the
Right.
connection was even more tenuous. And I think
Right.
this was Steve Laddick's point in his article, which is the standing argument is, even weaker for the challengers in that case. In other words, again, the people against the Biden administration, but yet they put the Biden program on hold. Here, the people bringing the lawsuit have a stronger standing claim, but they're like, go ahead. And yeah, the dissent is really, not happy about this, because the issue here is that Congress created a statute in 1979 called the Department of Education Organization Act, which created the Department of Education. And by the way, I looked up some history, which is actually on the US Department of Education website. Before Congress actually created the formal department, the Department of Education website says that the origins of the Department of Education actually goes back to 1867, when President Andrew Johnson signed legislation creating the first Department of Education. But there were concerns about that department exercising too much control over local schools, which is the argument that's being made now, ostensibly. So it was demoted to an Office of Education in 1868. So, there has been, maybe at a smaller level, but a federal entity that has been involved in, education since, since the 1868. And this eventually becomes the Department of Education in 1979. And I also learned that President Reagan originally tried to abolish the Department of Education, although he did it by submitting a proposal to Congress. And this is, I think, the issue that is ultimately going to be decided here, which is Congress has created this department by statute. It presumably the department can only be abolished by statute, but basically what the dissent is suggesting is, in firing all of these people by essentially making the department non-functional because it doesn't have staffing, what is effectively happening is that Trump is essentially abolishing the agency itself, which creates potential separation of powers issues. Because what the dissent says is Congress makes the laws, the president takes care that they're faithfully executed. But if he can effectively abolish an agency by firing everybody, he's now repealed a law effectively. And this is where you and I disagree, because you don't think that that's the case.
I think that word effectively is doing a lot of work there. And that's my only point and I think it's important for our listeners and viewers, for those of you viewing us in like the Legal AF channel or elsewhere, is that really what Trump is doing that's been the most effective, to pun intended, what the Trump administration is doing that's the most effective in terms of accomplishing their goals are things that aren't like sweeping legal changes, but are de facto changes. Where, we'll talk about later, they're doing all sorts of things to induce or encourage lots of federal employees to quit their jobs, right? And them by doing that, they can effectively cripple certain agencies where very little is actually being done by certain agencies, but the agency still exists on paper. And in some, it's very dramatic, like the CFPB, where it's like almost nothing is happening there right now. Okay, so I do think that we have to we have to deal with that reality that whether Trump fires half the employees, or the Trump administration and fires half the employees, or whether they give them all sorts of incentives and pressures to quit and half of them quit, that is much harder to challenge legally than Trump just signing some order saying, I hereby abolish the department. It's going to shutter itself tomorrow. And that's a problem. And it ultimately is a factual question that has to get borne out, that usually would not get borne out at this early of a stage in the proceedings.
Well, I think I disagree with you here, because the Department of Education, by virtue of being created by legislation, also has statutorily required functions that it has to provide. So it does seem like there is a legal obligation here. I think the dissent has it right that there is a fundamental separation of powers issue. You can imagine that Congress's power effectively becomes neutralized if it can if it says, we've passed a law that says this function has to exist. I mean, let's use another one. The CIA is created by statute.
Mm-hmm.
The CIA is supposed to gather intelligence. It is required to do certain things, and it's a statutorily created entity. If the president can simply say, well, I have the power to hire and fire everybody at will, and I'm just going to get rid of them, then you are not allowing Congress's function. He's not enforcing the law, which is what he's supposed to do, but he's also then neutralizing a co-equal branch. I think that's the problem here. And it does run into I think where you're going, presume something that you're not articulating, which is that this conservative majority's vision of the executive, which is embodied in the unitary executive theory, it presumes that that's correct, that he does have the power to hire and fire, and that there can be no limitations on that. And if that's the case, then it seems like Congress basically has no power at all, even if it creates an agency to ensure that it actually comes into effect.
Yeah, I think as a practical matter, I'm sort of describing what the problem is. I think there's a spectrum. I don't view this as black and white. I think there's going to be a spectrum of things that Trump is doing to try to cut away, retard. I don't want to use the word retard because it can be taken in a different context, but like to sort of hamper the functioning of certain agencies, certain departments, certain sections of certain departments. And some of those things are more effective than others. And some of them he's going to be able to do, and some of them he can't. And I view what he's doing in the Department of Education in the context of what he's doing in a bunch of other departments, like the CFPB. I gave an example. I mean, they're basically shutting that down. That was created by statute. And there's challenges there as well. Or let's say we've talked about certain sections of the Justice Department where not a lot is happening. You could even look at agencies where the agency still exists, but what if there's a directive like, we don't really want the SEC to be enforcing in certain areas. We want your priority to just be here and not be there. I think that as a practical matter, some of this he can get away with doing as the president. Some of it he can't. But I think if he can't, it's going to, unfortunately, at times require a factual, prove up, and ultimately in the district court that's not well suited to an injunction on the front end. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this. That's what I think.
Yeah, well, the injunction on the front end isn't actually supposed to make such a detailed determination, right? It's supposed to look at the likelihood of success on the merits. It's supposed to look at irreparable harm if the action is stopped or not stopped. And it's supposed to look at the balance of equities, or the balance of the hardships that occur. And I think the dissent's point here is, until that factual determination, on what, until we have a handle on what exactly is going on, happens, their view is that the factors all favored the in respondents in the case of the Supreme Court case, but the people bringing the lawsuit, because well, according to them, according to the dissent, the likelihood of success on the merits favors them because they have actually a statute on their side that should be effectuated. But also these issues of equities and irreparable harm, it does seem to me the feather on the scale, and I think more than a feather, it's really hard to undo this. Like, it's really hard for me to see in this case or in many of these other cases where the court is acting on this shadow docket, if you were to eventually get to a point where you say, oh yeah, oops, this is all totally illegal, like, stop doing it. How do you then go back and reverse this kind of action? And I think that is a part of what's happening here and why it is so troubling that the Supreme Court is allowing it to go on before that final determination is made.
Yeah, that is the part of this that I actually find the most problematic as well. In other words, and this is, by the way, not limited to the Department of Education. I keep making the point that this is broader because I think it's important for everyone listening to this to
It's
understand
happening in a
this.
lot of different contexts. This is
Yeah.
the play. This is the play.
Right. The State Department had tons and tons of people who were fired recently as well. I mean, there's still going to be a State Department, but thousands and thousands and thousands of people who had been working at the State Department for years and had all sorts of expertise and knowledge are now gone. And once they go and they find other jobs, getting them back is very difficult. And the people who might be available to come back are going to be the ones you don't want, the ones that are the least able to get other jobs, because a lot of these people who are really knowledgeable and have been there for a long time have really specialized skills and might get gobbled up by other employers, right? I mean, some of those valuable people might be hard to get back. So, yeah, undoing this is very challenging. That is really problematic. That would lead me, as a factual matter, to be to want to preserve the status quo as well. If I was a district judge, I think I wouldn't go as far. Some of the sweeping conclusions from the dissent, I wouldn't necessarily agree with. But I would
Like
also.
what?
I don't think this dismantles the department I don't think we can. I don't think we know enough. I understand that that's what Trump says he wants to do, but I don't think we know enough. But I think, and I don't think we know enough. I don't know about the likelihood of success in the merits yet, but I don't know enough to know that. But I think it's close enough of a call that you would want to keep the status quo, and accordingly, I wouldn't agree. I would dissent as well from this if I was in the Supreme Court. But I think that the problem is we don't have a majority opinion here. And I think that's the problem with the shadow docket, because how do you justify this? Like, how do you justify something that really can't be undone?
Yeah, and I just want to point out from the dissent here just a few things, just in terms of the impact, because we're talking in kind of the abstract here.
Right.
So first, the dissent points out that the mass terminations have prevented some colleges and universities from actually enrolling students. So
Mm-hmm.
schools have to get a certification from the Department of Education before they can admit students that are eligible for federal financial aid. And there's some kind of recertification process that takes a while, which the department has either not done or delayed. And so schools have not been able to enroll students. And of course, the students in those cases have missed out on that. There are, let's say, the New York State Education Department and the New Jersey Department of Education haven't been, and the Illinois State Board of Education, interestingly, all blue states, I will point out, have had issues because they coordinate, I guess, the federal funding, disbursement or reimbursement. And here's one thing that I think was definitely intentional here. The Office of English Language Acquisition, which oversees, I think, bilingual education, has basically been completely abolished. And that, I don't know if you saw this comment by Trump a day or two ago where he said, somebody asked about the Department of Education. He says, well, everybody should just speak English. That's what we need to have happen. So I definitely think there's, part of what the agenda here is to get rid of any kind of federal support for bilingual education, definitely any federal support for DEI initiatives, which we already know. But
Right.
it is happening. It is having some pretty serious impact to people on the ground, to states, to colleges and universities, and of course to students. And it is of a piece with what we're seeing with the direct assaults on the universities, and for and trying to get control over them. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure, because people may not understand what the Department of Education does, and how much it impacts on the ground stuff.
I agree. Yeah, I think that's really helpful context, Asha. And just to be clear, I think that cuts like this are just massive in their impact. And I point the some of the other departments I've been mentioning, I think are also significant. I mean, the State Department, that could have a massive impact on our national security, or the CFPB, has a very important role in protecting consumers. There's all sorts of ways in which this administration is transforming how the federal government functions and its ability to do its job. So I take all that very seriously, and I guess my reaction to it is this administration may be one of the most consequential, if not, one of the very most consequential in American history, and not in a positive way. And ultimately, people need to understand that while we can get focused on legal points, like things that they may even be able to get away with, like having a reduction in workforce, or potentially offering people a buyout and having people voluntarily quit, or moving a lot of people's locations so that they are induced to quit, or all sorts of other things that they've been doing. Ultimately, it can have like a really important long-term impact that's above and beyond like a particular Supreme Court order.
Yeah, I would just add here that the piece of this where this is something that was fully created by Congress. The Department of State, to some extent, is there to basically effectuate the executive branch's foreign policy. In other words, it is much more a core executive branch function. And so while he might be gutting the State Department or making it, non-functional, you could argue that at least to some degree that kind of falls within the core functions of the executive branch, and maybe that's just the prerogative, and that's just what he wants to do. When the executive branch essentially ceases to execute the laws that are passed by Congress, and by the way, not just in the downsizing or elimination of these agencies that have been congressionally created, but I also didn't ask Asha about the lack of enforcement of the TikTok ban, for example. What he's doing is usurping a legislative function, and he's taking he is taking on the ability to basically repeal laws, which is not an executive branch function.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a form of consolidation of power that should be concerning to everybody.
Yeah, I definitely think we should be. I think we should be very concerned. And I think from my perspective, I think your what you said is accurate regarding whether something's a core executive function or not. But I just think there's a variety of different agencies. I mean, like the CFPB I mentioned, that are not core and executive functions that Trump is very much scaling back. And I think we'll talk potentially a little later about a department in which there's a lot of scaling back being done as well, just in a different way.
Well, the takeaway here is that the wrecking ball continues, even though the courts, and probably ultimately the Supreme Court, hasn't finally decided on the legality of it. But by then, it might be too late.
For sure. So, Asha, I alluded a moment ago to another department, and that is going to be a department that's dear to both of our hearts because we both technically work for this department because the FBI is part of the Justice Department. It's the United States Department of Justice. And there's been so much going on in relation to the Justice Department that I think it makes sense to have DOJ potpourri.
Yes, DOJ potpourri. And I think to connect it to our first discussion, I mean, DOJ, kind of like the State Department, is one of those agencies that is fully an executive branch function. And
Right.
we have been very fortunate, I think, since, the creation of the Justice Department for much of its history, that there has been a lot of independence that has grown over time, that grew over time between the Justice Department and the White House, despite the fact that it is fully an executive branch department that is there to operationalize the take care clause of Article 2 of the Constitution. But I think one of the big eye-opening things for a lot of people since, even the first Trump administration is that is not required in any way, shape, or form. That is just a norm. And if you get people into these agencies, particularly leading them, that don't ascribe to those norms, and by the way, people like J. Edgar Hoover was fiercely independent. These are longstanding norms, even with conservative leaders of people in these agencies, but we don't have that anymore. And I think it's now taking a toll on the lawyers and agents, frankly, and the FBI of the Justice Department itself.
That's right. And one of the things we've been seeing, Asha, is a mass exodus from the DOJ. I mean, I had sent you an article this week that I thought was interesting. I think it was like 80% of the lawyers in the federal programs branch of the DOJ have left since the beginning of the Trump administration. They're down like 80 something percent. Am I right about that? Or is that almost 80%?
Sorry, do we want to
No,
pause here, or do you want to
let's
double check?
pause. Yeah, let me here. Let me pull that up because I
There's
want
2/3 of the lawyers.
2/3 of the lawyers have quit. Okay,
Yeah.
let me do that over.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Asha, look, I think that that really ties into in many ways what we were talking about a minute ago with the Department of Education. Because if you look at some of the sections of the Justice Department, like the federal programs branch now, there was just a recent article that says 2/3 of the lawyers at the federal programs branch have left since the beginning of the Trump administration. I mean, they are down so far in numbers. That's more than what we were talking about at the Department of Education. It's just that instead of it just being all done in one fell swoop in a reduction in four RIF, you have these people leaving because they're being asked to take positions that they think are unethical, or that they can't responsibly advance in court, or perhaps some of them are obviously seeing the writing on the wall and they're deciding themselves to leave. But that is the part of the Justice Department that is in charge of defending federal statutes, for example. So that would be the part of the Justice Department that would be really important now, given all the stuff the Trump administration is doing, and they're basically gutted.
Well, it's there to defend federal statutes and I guess the president's interpretation of them, or the president's policies based on them. So the federal programs branch was also the branch that was defending the birthright citizenship EO, for example.
Right.
Things that deal with separation of powers. I'm guessing probably the Department of Education litigation that we just talked about would be coming out of the federal programs branch as well. And so this is the branch that is defending the dismantling of, big parts of the government administrative state that is trying to reinterpret the Constitution. And don't forget, Renato, that when Trump first came in office after Attorney General Pam Bondi was confirmed, do you remember that there was that memo that was sent out to Department of Justice employees that basically said that the president's interpretation of these laws is what is determinative for the Justice Department. Again, there's no like kind of independent analysis, I guess, that the Justice Department is going to do, and that if people didn't like it, they could just quit. I mean, that was what the message was. Whereas normally you have a president who has some kind of policy program. It goes to, I guess, the Office of Legal Counsel. I mean, in other words, they give feedback on the legality of it. They might go back and forth about how to tweak it and to get the outcome that the president wants. So, for example, in the George W. administration, when they were trying to figure out where to put the detainees, and they came up with Guantanamo Bay, but they were they were lawyers who were looking at, you can do this, you can't do this because this would be illegal. Whereas now, what's legal is just basically whatever Trump wants to do, and they're just going to find a way to do it. Even if, apparently, based on some of these whistleblower reports, even if that means going in and lying in court.
Yeah, well, one of the other memos that came out was essentially one saying, like, you can't, if you don't want to advance essentially it's like, if you don't want to advance certain positions, like, then, like, you're not doing your job. Like, basically quit.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. It was like, you need to leave.
Yeah. It's essentially like, don't exercise independent judgment. Don't exercise your own sense of what your ethical obligations are, etc. Yeah, it was something, and I think some similar statements were made by the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, Harmeet Dhilan, talking about how some of her employees, some of the attorneys there think it's like McDonald's, like you can pick and choose which of the policies you want to support or not of the administration, and it's not, in her mind, not a McDonald's. Like, you have to 100%, sign on to everything that the administration wants to do, period. And, that may be why, by the way, the vast majority of attorneys in the Civil Rights Division are no longer there, right? And that's an example. Yes, it's in a core executive function, but that's an example of a division that's not doing a lot of the things, I mean, I wouldn't say anything, but a lot of the things that we would ordinarily consider the Civil Rights Division to be responsible for doing right now.
Oh, it's doing stuff, though, Renato. Aaron Rupar, who has a great newsletter called Public Notice on Substack, and I will put that in the show notes. He actually has a great comprehensive overview of all the crazy that's happening in the Justice Department, but he has a section on, not a section, but he has a couple paragraphs on Harmeet Dhilan, and he says, he calls her a culture warrior who brags about outsourcing her prosecutorial discretion to Twitter randos. And then he quotes from the Wall Street Journal, and this is something. She begins her workday scrolling through X, searching for claims of discrimination. A lot of them, Dhilan said, regard universities. After spotting, quote, a list of new horrors, end quote, again, on X, quote, I text my deputies and we assign cases and we get cranky, end quote. So they are doing cases. They're just cases that are based on tweets on X. He also notes that the Civil Rights Division is undoing consent decrees with local police departments, where cops agree not to violate the civil rights of the people that they are serving. So yes, 70% of lawyers in that unit have left. Also, Pam Bondi had dismantled the public corruption unit, or significantly downsized it, downsized the Foreign Agent Registration Act enforcement, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement. So there's a lot of stuff that's not being done on that front as well. So yes. And
yes, a lot's not happening right now.
Not happening. And we saw, in the very beginning, before this exodus, I mean, we saw the tip of the spear, which was Danielle Sassoon, who resigned or I can't remember if she resigned or was fired, but she wrote the long letter because she refused to participate in the Eric Adams case. So all of this brings us to Emil Bove, who, as part of our Department of Justice potpourri, who has been nominated for a federal judgeship. And basically, I think another extraordinary thing is the number of Justice Department alumni, and now actually like 80 federal judges who have submitted letters saying that he is completely unqualified for this job.
Yeah, and also a whistleblower, right, who has come forward with communications and so on, talking about like highly questionable actions taken by Mr. Bove that I think are, leading many senators to try to rally support and flip enough Republican votes to, defeat that nomination.
Yeah, I think highly questionable is an understatement. I mean, basically, that whistleblower complaint statement. I mean, everybody focused on the FU piece of F the courts or whatever he supposedly said. But the meat of that complaint comes in later, where there are actual actions that are being taken by the Justice Department that are actively violating court orders under his watch, perhaps at his command. So that's happening.
Yeah, well, that sounds like federal judge material, Asha.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think this gets to how much capital is being burned with the Justice Department. I mean, I used to, even in the first Trump administration, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's weird to sort of look back and be wistful about Rod Rosenstein and Jeff Sessions or something. But I think that the Justice Department was the jewel in the crown of our federal agencies. It was, I think, widely trusted, widely respected. It brought in people of all different political backgrounds and beliefs to, engage in, I think, a common mission.
Yeah, and in many, I think I've mentioned to you before, Asha, that in many parts of the country, like Chicago, where I'm from, the Justice Department is an important part of policing state and local government. I mean, in our state, that people take very seriously investigations by the feds, because that's the way we deal with corrupt politicians locally. And having a Justice Department that's not exercising independent judgment, that is essentially just operating based on the whims of the president and the political leanings of the president, the deals being cut in a back room by the president. That's not a Justice Department that's going to generate that level of respect. And so, one thing that's challenging as somebody who litigates a lot against the Justice Department, a lot of judges will defer so much to what a Justice Department lawyer says. And that's because of decades and decades and decades of credibility that have been built up. And that is changing, and that's what this is undoing. So yes, it may be more of a core executive function, and it may be less. It's not like a big reduction in force in the same way, but what's happening here in the Justice Department is tremendously damaging and can't be undone easily either.
No, it is going to fundamentally change the culture of the Justice Department. And I think if we're ever lucky, I think with all of this stuff, to tie it back into our first block, I kind of have been down because I'm like, to get to the irreversible harm part of these, different actions being taken. I don't know what happens after this. If we are ever fortunate enough to kind of get back into a place where we can rebuild, I guess you rebuild from scratch. I mean, I don't even know. I don't understand how, I don't think you can just salvage or just kind of come back and start allowing, just manage the agencies that are like basically on life support or skeletons of what they used to be. It seems like you would have to just wipe the slate clean and almost have like a whole new deal, recreate agencies, build them again from the ground up, because at that point they will be infected, with loyalists, with people who are not socialized into cultures where they are expected to be nonpartisan, to be in service of something greater than themselves, that meaning the Constitution, not a person. They just won't be the same places.
Well, they'll also lack a lot of the expertise, the capabilities, and the activity that can often take more than one administration. So you might have an investigation that starts now that would end up being completed in the next administration, but you're going to have a new administration coming in with all sorts of problems, all sorts of things that aren't getting done, less people to do them with. It's going to take a lot. And, one thing that I think won't be able to happen is, there was, after the first Trump administration, I think former President Biden came in and I think had this mentality that, like, look, let's just pretend like these 4 years didn't happen.
That was a
And
mistake.
it was. It
That was
was.
a huge mistake.
Such a huge mistake. Didn't confront the Trumpism, didn't confront these issues. And I don't see how any new president coming in here can possibly ignore what has happened here, because the damage is so significant. The change is so significant. So much of what we understand to be the normal activity of these agencies will not be happening for years, because we're only in the first several months here, Asha. I think it will take, as you suggested, almost like you said, another New Deal. It is going to take a rebirth and renewal and lots of hiring and lots of change. And that's going to take time. It might take an entire administration just to kind of get these agencies staffed back up and running again. And then if you don't have that president win another term, can get undone again.
Yeah. It's going to be hard too if the Supreme Court kind of continues to go down this road where it's like essentially any new president can come in and just wipe it all out again. So it's not even that you have to rebuild this. It's almost like and I almost feel like we would need also like constitutional amendments to redefine the separation of powers and recalibrate them in some meaningful way that doesn't allow, a conservative court to essentially allow any president to consolidate power.
Yeah, I mean, constitutional amendments in the how divided this country are basically non-starters. You need 2/3 of let's say the Senate, right? You're never going to get that, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's
I'm
the
just saying
problem.
that the norms have been trampled upon so greatly that that's kind of the level of repair that you would really need at some level to kind of, even if you could fix it, to ensure that it doesn't happen again. But anyway, that's a reckoning that we can get to down the line. I completely agree with you that it was a huge mistake of the Biden administration to not confront the damage head on. He's not the first, by the way. I mean, I remember that Obama also swept, for example, the George W. administration's torture program under the rug, did not confront it, didn't have, it's, we're no longer in that world where you just, pretend in the interest of, I guess, presidential, comity to ignore the last administration's missteps and move on. I don't think we can do that this time.
I agree with that.
Next time, if there is a next time.
If there is a next time. So, Asha, before we go, I have been watching on Instagram your trip with your daughter to France to unfold. It's been really something. And by the way, you have an absolutely beautiful daughter who looks a lot like you.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. So, how was this trip? It seems absolutely fabulous.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it was great. So she is doing a 2-week program at the Paris College of Art. And so I didn't want to just stick her on a plane and, send her to Paris. So I decided to go out with her, make sure she gets settled in. And so we went out early so we could do some sightseeing, because she's going to be, doing her work during the time she's there, and it would be a shame for her to be there for 2 weeks and not see things. So yeah, so you saw my little videos where I chronicled different parts of it. Which videos did you like? What do you remember?
Okay, the one that was really cool was, were you making I forget the kind of cookie they are, macaroons. Were you making
Macarons.
macarons? Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Okay, this is the Midwesterner in me coming out. So macarons. Okay, excuse me. That was really cool to see that as being made.
Yeah, she's a big baker. And one of the things I now love about traveling is that, you have these different companies that, like, TripAdvisor and Viter and all these places that can you can select from all of these things to do while you're there, which are really cool. So yes, we did a macaron making class, and she's a baker and she loves making macarons at home. But she kind of got more about the technique. It was the chef that was teaching the class. Actually, it was his mom who was kind of doing most of the talking because she speaks English, and I think he doesn't speak a lot of English. But he has trained as a pastry chef in France. So he was showing the technique and how you can know when your meringue peaks are stiff enough, and you turn the bowl over and nothing falls out and things like that. So it was really fun. We also did a perfume making class.
Oh, wow.
At a perfumery called Molinard.
I was wondering, I saw the Molinard pics that you had.
Yes. Yeah. And that was really interesting because, basically they have this, whatever, like 100 different bottles of different notes. And they teach you how you design a fragrance. So you start with the top notes, which are the lighter notes. So you pick like 3 of those, and then there's a middle 3 notes, and then there's like 4 base notes. And so you have to go through and kind of create your combination of top, middle, and base notes. And then they give you the formula to basically build your own perfume, and you walk home with your own perfume. And it's so funny because the woman that was overseeing that, like, she clearly, she so knows what she's doing. And she, like, my daughter and I were talking about how she kind of judged our perfumes, because at the end, like, she smells the different notes we've decided, and she's like, "Are you really sure you want the honey? The honey is a little warm." You can just, I'm like, "Lady, I can't even smell anything anymore." Okay. Like, I'm just
oh my God.
for like 2 hours now. So anyway, 2 very French things that we did, but we also did an evening tour of the Louvre.
Oh, that's cool.
Which, I think on Fridays it's open in the evening. So much fewer crowds. And we were able to, we saw a lot more stuff than the Mona Lisa. That was our last stop. We had a private tour guide, but we did get right up to it. Saw that and the Venus de Milo, but we also spent a lot of time with the Flemish painters. And we also went to the summit of the Eiffel Tower.
That's super cool. That sounds like a great trip, and she's really lucky to have that experience. That's very cool. I don't know if she'll actually be studying and doing her work for the couple weeks after, but if she is, this is a great way of leading up to that.
Yeah, I hope that she'll remember it forever.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.